Aleister Crowley's Moonchild, Chapter 1. A Chinese God. London, in England, the capital city of the British Empire, is situated upon the banks of the Thames. It is not likely that these facts were unfamiliar to James Abbott McNeill Whistler, a Scottish gentleman born in America and resident in Paris, but it is certain that he did not appreciate them, for he settled quietly down to discover a fact which no one had previously observed, namely, that it was very beautiful at night. The man was steeped in Highland fantasy, and he revealed London as wrapped in a soft haze of mystic beauty, a fairy tale of delicacy and wistfulness. It is here that the fates showed partiality, for London should rather have been painted by Goya. The city is monstrous and misshapen. Its mystery is not a brooding, but a conspiracy, and these truths are evident above all to one who recognises that London's heart is Charing Cross. The old cross, which is, even technically, the centre of the city, is so in sober moral geography. The Strand roars towards Fleet Street, and so to Ludgate Hill, crowned by St. Paul's Cathedral. Whitehall sweeps down to Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament. Trafalgar Square, which guards it at the third angle, saves it to some extent from the modern banalities of Piccadilly and Pall Mall, mere Georgian sham stucco, not even rivals to the historic grandeur of the great religious monuments, for Trafalgar really did make history. But it is to be observed that Nelson, on his monument, is careful to turn his gaze upon the Thames. For here is the true life of the city, the altar of that great heart of which London and Westminster are the ventricles. Charing Cross Station, moreover, is the only true metropolitan terminus. Euston, St. Pancras and King's Cross merely convey one to the provinces, even perhaps to savage Scotland, as nude and barren today as in the time of Dr. Johnson. Victoria and Paddington seem to serve the vices of Brighton and Bournemouth in winter, Maidenhead and Henley in summer. Liverpool Street and Fenchurch Street are mere suburban sewers. Waterloo is the funeral antechamber to Woking. Great Central is a notion imported, name and all, from Broadway, by an enterprising kind of railway, Barnum, named Yerkes. Nobody ever goes there, except to golf at Sandy Lodge. If there are any other terminals in London, I forget them, clear proof of their insignificance. But Charing Cross dates from before the Norman Conquest. Here Caesar scorned the advances of Boadicea, who had come to the station to meet him, and here St. Augustine uttered his famous mot, non angeli, sed angeli. Stay, there is no need to exaggerate. Honestly, Charing Cross is the true link with Europe, and therefore with history. It understands its dignity and its destiny. The station officials never forget the story of King Alfred and the cakes, and are too wrapped up in the cares of who knows what to pay any attention to the necessities of would-be travellers. The speed of the trains is adjusted to that of the Roman legions, 3 miles per hour, and they are always late in honour of the immortal Fabius, qui concontaco restitutut rem, who by delay saved the state, said in praise of Fabius, cant totorto, or the delayer. This terminus is swathed in immemorable gloom. It was in one of the waiting rooms that James Thomson conceived the idea for his City of Dreadful Night, but it is still the heart of London, throbbing with a clear longing towards Paris. A man who goes to Paris from Victoria will never reach Paris. He will find only the city of the demi-mondaine and the tourist. It was not by appreciation of these facts, that it was even by instinct, that Lavinia King chose to arrive at Charing Cross. She was in her peculiar esoteric style the most famous dancer in the world, and she was about to poise upon one exquisite toe in London, execute one blithe pirouette and leap to Petersburg. No, her reason for alighting at Charing Cross was utterly unconnected with any one of the facts hitherto discussed. Had you asked her, she would have replied with her unusual smile, insured for $75,000. that it was convenient for the Savoy Hotel. So, on that October night, when London almost shouted its pity and terror at the poet, she only opened the windows of her suite because it was unseasonably hot. It was nothing to her that they gave on to the historic Temple Gardens, nothing that London's favourite bridge for suicides loomed dark beside the lighted span of the railway. She was merely bored of her friend and constant companion, Lisa la Giuffria, who had been celebrating her birthday for 23 hours without cessation as Big Ben toiled 11. Lisa was having her fortune told for the 8th time that day by a lady so stout and so ironclad in corsets that any reliable authority on high explosives might have been tempted to hurl her into Temple Gardens, lest the worst thing come to him, and so intoxicated that she was certainly worth her weight in grape juice to any temperance lecturer. The name of this lady was Amy Brough, and she told the cards with resistless reiteration. "You'll certainly have 13 birthday presents," she said for the 113th time, "and then that means a death in the family. Then there's a letter about a journey, and there's something about a dark man connected with a large building. He's very tall, and I think there's a journey coming to you. Something about a letter. Yes, 9 and 3's 12, and 1's 13. You'll certainly have 13 presents." "I've only had 12, complained Lisa, who was tired, bored, and peevish. "Oh, forget it," snapped Lavinia King from the window. "You've got an hour to go anyhow." "I see something about a large building," insisted Amy Brough. "I think it means hasty news." "That's extraordinary," cried Lisa, suddenly awake. "That's what Bunyip said my dream last night meant. That's absolutely wonderful, and to think there are people who don't believe in clairvoyance." From the depths of an armchair came a sigh of infinite sadness. "Gimme a peach." Harsh and hollow the voice issued cavernously from a Latin-jawed American with blue cheeks. He was incongruously clad in a Greek dress with sandals. It is difficult to find a philosophical reason for disliking the combination of this costume with a pronounced Chicago accent, but one does. He was Lavinia's brother. He wore the costume as an advertisement. It was part of the family game. As he himself would explain in confidence, it made people think he was a fool, which enabled him to pick their pockets while they were preoccupied with this amiable delusion. "Who said peaches?" observed a second sleeper, a young Jewish artist of uncannily clever powers of observation. Lavinia King went from the window to the table. 4 enormous silver bowls occupied it. 3 contained the finest flowers to be bought in London, the tribute of the natives to her talent. The 4th was brimmed with peaches at 4 shillings a peach. She threw 1 apiece to her brother and the knight of the silver point. "I can't make out this jack of clubs," went on Amy Brough. "It's something about a large building." Bluestein, the artist, buried his face and his heavy curved spectacles in his peach. "Yes, dearie," went on Amy with a hiccough. "There's a journey about a letter, and 9 and 1's 10, and there's 3's 13. You'll get another present, dearie, as sure as I'm sitting here." "I really will?" asked Lisa, yawning. "If I never take my hand off this table again." "Oh, cat it out," cried Lavinia. "I'm going to bed." "If you go to bed on my birthday, I'll never speak to you again." "Oh, can't we do something?" said Bluestein, who never did anything anyhow but draw. "Sing something," said Lavinia's brother, throwing away the peach stone and settling himself again to sleep. Big Ben struck the half hour. Big Ben is far too big to take any notice of anything terrestrial. A change of dynasty is nothing in his young life. "Come in for the land's sake," cried Lavinia King. Her quick ear had caught a light knock upon the door. She had hoped for something exciting, but it was only her private tame pianist, a cadaverous individual with the manners of an undertaker gone mad, the morals of a stool pigeon, and imagining himself a bishop. "I had to wish you many happy returns," he said to Lisa when he had greeted the company in general, "and I wanted to introduce my friend, Cyril Grey." Everyone was amazed. They only then perceived that a second man had entered the room without being heard or seen. This individual was thin and tall, almost as the pianist, but he had the peculiar quality of failing to attract attention. When they saw him, he acted in the most conventional way possible, a smile and a bow and a formal handshake and the right word of greeting. But the moment their introductions were over, he apparently vanished. The conversation became general. Amy Brower went to sleep, Bluestein took his leave, Arnold King followed, the pianist rose for the same purpose and looked round for his friend. Only then did anyone observe that he was seated on the floor with crossed legs, perfectly indifferent to the company. The effect of the discovery was hypnotic. From being nothing in the room, he became everything. Even Lavinia King, who had wearied of the world at 30 and was now 43, saw that here was something new to her. She looked at that impassive face. The jaw was square, the planes of the face curiously flat. The mouth was small, a poppy petal of vermilion, intensely sensuous. The nose was small and rounded, but fine, and the life of the face seemed concentrated in the nostrils. The eyes were tiny and oblique, with strange brows of defiance. A small tuft of irrepressible hair upon the forehead started up like a lone pine tree on the slope of a mountain. For with this exception the man was entirely bald, or rather clean-shaven, for the scalp was grey. The skull was extraordinarily narrow and long. Again she looked at the eyes. They were parallel, focused on infinity. The pupils were pinpoints. It was clear to her that he saw nothing in the room. Her dancer's vanity came to her rescue. She moved in front of the still figure and made a mock obeisance. She might have done the same to a stone image. To her astonishment, she found the hand of Lisa on her shoulder. A look, half shocked, half pious, was in her friend's eyes. She found herself rudely pushed aside. Turning, she saw Lisa squatting on the floor opposite the visitor, with her eyes fixed upon his. He remained apparently quite unconscious of what was going on. Lavinia King was flooded with a sudden causeless anger. She plucked her pianist by the arm and threw him to the window-seat. Rumour accused Lavinia of too close intimacy with the musician, and rumour does not always lie. She took advantage of the situation to caress him. Monet not, for that was his name, took her action as a matter of course. Her passion satisfied alike his purse and his vanity, and, being without temperament, he was the curate type of ladies' man. He suited the dancer, who would have found a more masterful lover in her way. This creature could not even excite the jealousy of the wealthy automobile manufacturer who financed her. But this night she could not concentrate her thoughts upon him. They wandered continually to the man on the floor. "Who is she?" she whispered rather fiercely. "What did you say his name was?" "Cyril Grey," answered Monet not indifferently. "He's probably the greatest man in England in his art." "And what's his art?" "Nobody knows," was the surprising reply. "He won't show anything. He's the one big mystery of London." "I never heard such nonsense," retorted the dancer angrily. "Anyhow, I'm from Missouri." The pianist stared. "I mean, you've got to show me," she explained. "He looks to me like one big bluff." Monet shrugged his shoulders. He did not care to pursue that topic. Suddenly Big Ben struck midnight. It woke the room to normality. Cyril Grey unwound himself like a snake after 6 months' sleep, but in a moment he was a normal, suave gentleman, all smiles and bows again. He thanked Miss King for a very pleasant evening. He only tore himself away from a consideration of the lateness of the hour. "Do come again," said Lavinia sarcastically. "One doesn't often enjoy so delightful a conversation." "My birthday's over," moaned Lisa from the floor, "and I haven't got my 13th present." Amy Browse half woke up. "It's something to do with a large building," she began, and broke off suddenly, abashed, she knew not why. "I'm always in at tea-time," said Lisa suddenly to Cyril. He simpered over her hand. Before they realized it, he had bowed himself out of the room. The three women looked at each other. Suddenly Lavinia King began to laugh. It was a harsh, unnatural performance, and for some reason her friend took it amiss. She went tempestuously into her bedroom and banged the door behind her. Lavinia, almost equally cross, went into the opposite room and called her maid. In half an hour she was asleep. In the morning she went in to see her friend. She found her lying on the bed, still dressed, her eyes red and haggard. She had not slept all night. Amy Brow, on the contrary, was still asleep in the armchair. When she was roused, she only muttered something about a journey in a letter. Then she suddenly shook herself and went off without a word to a place of business in Bond Street. For she was the representative of one of the great parish dressmaking houses. Lavinia King never knew how it was managed. She never realized even that it had been managed, but that afternoon she found herself inextricably bound to her motor millionaire. So Lisa was alone in the apartment. She sat upon the couch with great eyes, black and lively, staring into eternity. Her black hair coiled upon her head, plait over plait, her dark skin glowed, her full mouth moved continually. She was not surprised when the door opened without warning. Cyril Grey closed it behind him with swift stealth. She was fascinated. She could not rise to greet him. He came over to her, caught her throat in both his hands, bent back her head, and taking her lips in his teeth, bit them almost through. It was a single, deliberate act. Instantly he released her, sat down upon the couch by her, and made some trivial remark about the weather. She gazed at him in horror and amazement. He took no notice. He poured out a flood of small talk, theatres, politics, literature, the latest news of art. Ultimately she recovered herself enough to order tea when the maid knocked. After tea, another ordeal of small talk, she had made up her mind. Or, more accurately, she had become conscious of herself. She knew that she belonged to this man, body and soul. Every trace of shame departed. It was burnt out by the fire that consumed her. She gave him 1,000 opportunities. She fought to turn his words to serious things. He baffled her with this shallow smile and ready tongue that twisted all topics to triviality. By 6 o'clock she was morally on her knees before him. She was imploring him to stay to dinner with her. He refused. He was engaged to dine with a Miss Badger in Cheyne Walk. Possibly he might telephone later if he got away early. She begged him to excuse himself. He answered, serious for the first time, that he never broke his word. At last he rose to go. She clung to him. He pretended mere embarrassment. She became a tigress. He pretended innocence with that silly, shallow smile. He looked at his watch. Suddenly his manner changed, like a flash. "I'll telephone later if I can," he said with a sort of silky ferocity, and flung her from him violently onto the sofa. He was gone. She lay upon the cushions and sobbed her heart out. The whole evening was a nightmare for her, and also for Lavinia King. The pianist, who had looked in with the idea of dinner, was thrown out with objurgations. Why had he brought that cad, that brute, that fool? Amy Brow was caught by her fat wrists and sat down to the cards. For the first time that she said large building was bundled bodily out of the apartment. Finally Lavinia was astounded to have Lisa tell her that she would not come to see her dance, her only appearance that season in London. It was incredible, but when she had gone, thoroughly huffed, Lisa threw on her wraps to follow her, then changed her mind before she had gone halfway down the corridor. Her evening was a tempest of indecisions. When Big Ben sounded 11, she was lying on the floor, collapsed. A moment later the telephone rang. It was Cyril Grey. Of course, how could it be any other? "When are you likely to be in?" he was asking. She could imagine the faint, hateful smile, as if she had known it all her life. "Never," she answered. "I'm going to Paris the first train tomorrow." "Then I'd better come up now." The voice was nonchalant as death, or she would have hung up the receiver. "You can't come now. I'm undressed." "Then when may I come?" It was terrible, this antinomy of persistence with a stifled yawn. Her soul failed her. "When you will," she murmured. The receiver dropped from her hand, but she caught one word, the word taxi. In the morning she awoke almost a corpse. He had come and he had gone. He had not spoken a single word, not even given a token that he would come again. She told her maid to pack for Paris, but she could not go. Instead she fell ill. Hysteria became neurasthenia, yet she knew that a single word would cure her. But no word came. Incidentally, she heard that Cyril Grey was playing golf at Hoylake. She had a mad impulse to go to find him, another to kill herself. But Lavinia King, perceiving after many days that something was wrong, after many days, for her thoughts rarely strayed beyond the contemplation of her own talents and amusements, carried her off to Paris. She needed her anyhow to play hostess. But 3 days after their arrival, Lisa received a postcard. It bore nothing but an address and a question mark. No signature. She had never seen the handwriting, but she knew. She snatched up her hat and her furs and ran downstairs. Her car was at the door. In 10 minutes she was knocking at the door of Cyril's studio. He opened. His arms were ready to receive her, but she was on the floor, kissing his feet. "My Chinese God! My Chinese God!" she cried. "May I be permitted," observed Cyril earnestly, "to present my friend and master, Mr. Simon If?" Lisa looked up. She was in the presence of a man, very old, but very alert and active. She scrambled to her feet in confusion. "I am not really the master," said the old man cordially, "for our host is the Chinese God, as it appears. I am merely a student of Chinese philosophy." Moonchild by Aleister Crowley, Chapter 2. A philosophical disquisition upon the nature of the soul. There is little difference, barring our occidental subtlety, between Chinese philosophy and English, observed Cyril Grey. The Chinese bury a man alive in an ant-heap. The English introduce him to a woman. Lisa Lagiorafia was startled into normality by the words. They were not spoken in jest, and she began to take stock of her surroundings. Cyril Grey himself was radically changed. In fashionable London he had worn a claret-coloured suit, an enormous grey butterfly tie hiding a soft silk collar. In Bohemian Paris his costume was diabolically clerical in its formality. A frock coat, tightly buttoned to the body, fell to the knees. Its cut was as severe as it was distinguished. The trousers were a sober grey. A big black four-in-hand tie was fastened about a tall, uncompromising collar by a cabochon sapphire so dark as to be hardly noticeable. A rimless monocle was fixed in his right eye. His manner had changed to parallel his dress. The supercilious air was gone, the smile was gone. He might have been a diplomatist at the crisis of an empire. He looked even more like a duellist. The studio in which he stood was situated on the Boulevard Arago, below the Santi Prism. It was reached from the road through an archway which opened upon a oblong patch of garden. Across this a row of studios nestled, and behind these again were upper gardens, one to each studio, whose gates gave on to a tiny pathway. It was not only private, it was rural. One might have been 10 miles from the city limits. The studio itself was severely elegant, simplex manditis. Its walls were concealed by dull tapestries. In the centre of the room stood a square carved ebony table, matched by a sideboard in the west and a writing desk in the east. 4 chairs with high Gothic backs stood about the table. In the north was a divan, covered with the pelt of a polar bear. The floor was also furred, but with black bears from the Himalayas. On the table stood a Burmese dragon of dark green bronze. The smoke of incense issued from its mouth. But Simon If was the strangest object in that strange room. She had heard of him, of course. He was known for his writings on mysticism, and had long borne the reputation of a crank. But in the last few years he had chosen to use his abilities in ways intelligible to the average man. It was he who had saved Professor Briggs, and incidentally England, when that genius had been accused of and condemned to death for murder, but was too preoccupied with the fear of his new flying machine to notice that his fellows were about to hang him. And it was he who had solved a dozen other mysteries of crime, with apparently no other resource than pure capacity to analyse the minds of men. People had consequently begun to revise their opinions of him. They even began to read his books. But the man himself remained unspeakably mysterious. He had a habit of disappearing for long periods, and it was rumoured that he had the secret of the elixir of life. For although he was known to be over 80 years of age, his brightness and activity would have done credit to a man of 40, and the vitality of his whole being, the fire of his eyes, the quick conciseness of his mind, bore witness to an interior energy almost more than human. He was a small man, dressed carefully in a blue serge suit with a narrow dark red tie. His iron grey hair was curly and irrepressible. His complexion, although wrinkled, was clear and healthy. His small mouth was a moving wreath of smiles, and his whole being radiated an intense and contagious happiness. His greeting to Lisa had been more than cordial. At Cyril's remark he took her friendly by the arm and sat her down on the divan. "I'm sure you smoke," he said. "Never mind Cyril. Try one of these. They come from the Khediv's own man." He extracted an immense cigar case from his pocket. One side was full of long patagas, the other of cigarettes. "These are musk-scented, the dark ones. The yellowish ones are ambergris, and the feet and white ones are scented with attar roses." Lisa hesitated, then she chose the ambergris. The old man laughed happily. "Just the right choice, the middle way. Now I know what we are going to be friends." He lit a cigarette and his own cigar. "I know what is in your mind, my dear young lady. You are thinking that two's company and three's none, and I agree. But we're going to put that right by asking Brother Cyril to study his Kabbalah for a little. For before leaving him in the ant-heap, he has really a shocking turn of mind. I want a little chat with you. You see, you are one of us now, my dear." "I don't understand," uttered the girl rather angrily, as Cyril obediently went to his desk, pulled a large square volume out of it, and became immediately engrossed. "Brother Cyril has told me of your 3 interviews with him, and I am perfectly prepared to give a description of your mind. You are in rude health, and yet you are hysterical. You are fascinated and subdued by all things weird and unusual, though to the world you hold yourself so high, proud and passionate. You need love, it is true. So much you know yourself, and you know also that no common love attracts you. You need the sensational, the bizarre, the unique, but perhaps you do not understand what is at the root of that passion. I will tell you. You have an inexpressible hunger of the soul. You despise earth and its delusions, and you aspire unconsciously to a higher life than anything this planet can offer. I will tell you something that may convince you of my right to speak. You were born on October the 11th, so Brother Cyril told me, but he did not tell me the hour. You never told him. It was a little before sunrise." Lisa was taken aback. The mystic had guessed right. "The order to which I belong," pursued Simon, does not believe anything. It knows or it doubts, as the case may be, and it seeks even to increase human knowledge by the method of science, that is to say, by observation and experiment. Therefore you must not expect me to satisfy your real craving by answering your questions as to the existence of the soul, but I will tell you what I know and can prove, further what hypotheses seem worthy of consideration, lastly what experiments ought to be tried, for it is in this last matter that you can aid us, and with this in mind I've come up from St. Jean-de-Luz to see you." Lisa's eyes danced with pleasure. "Do you know," she cried, "you are the first man that ever understood me." "Let me see whether I do understand you fully. I know very little of your life. You are half Italian, evidently, the other half probably Irish." "Quite right." "You come of peasant stock, but you were brought up in refined surroundings, and your nature developed on the best lines possible without check. You married early." "Yes, but there was trouble. I divorced my husband and married again 2 years later." "That was Marquis La Giotria?" "Yes." "Well then, you left him, although he was a good husband, and devoted to you, to throw in your lot with Lavinian King." "I have lived with her for 5 years, almost to a month." "Then why? I used to know her pretty well myself. She was even in those days vulgar, stupid, heartless, and mercenary. She was a sponger, the worst type of courtesan, and she was an intolerable posée. Every word of hers must have disgusted you, yet you stick to her closer than a brother." "That's all true, but she's a sublime genius, the greatest artist the world has ever seen." "She has a genius," distinguished Simon, Her dancing is a species of angelic possession, if I may coin a phrase. She comes off the stage from an interpretation of the subtlest and most spiritual music of Chopin or Tchaikovsky, and forthwith proceeds to scold, to wheedle, or to blackmail. Can you explain that reasonably by talking of two sides to her character? It is nonsense to do so. The only analogy is that of a noble thinker and his stupid, dishonest, and immoral secretary. The dictation is taken down correctly and given to the world. The last person to be enlightened by it is the secretary himself. So I take it is the case with all genius, only in many cases the man is in more or less conscious harmony with his genius, and strives eternally to make himself a worthier instrument for his master's touch. The clever man, so called, the man of talent, shuts out his genius by setting up his conscious will as a positive entity. The true man of genius deliberately subordinates himself, reduces himself to a negative, and allows his genius to play through him as it will. We all know how stupid we are when we try to do things. Seek to make any other muscle work as consistently as your heart does without your silly interference. You cannot keep it up for 48 hours. I forget what the record is, but it's not much over 24. All this, which is truth ascertained and certain, lies at the base of the Taoist doctrine of non-action, the plan of doing everything by seeming to do nothing. Yield yourself utterly to the will of heaven, and you become the omnipotent instrument of that will. Most systems of mysticism have a similar doctrine, but that it is true in action is only properly expressed by the Chinese. Nothing that any man can do will improve that genius, but the genius needs his mind, and he can broaden that mind, fertilize it with knowledge of all kinds, improve its powers of expression, supply the genius, in short, with an orchestra instead of a tin whistle. All our little great men, our one-poem poets, our one-picture painters, have merely failed to perfect themselves as instruments. The genius who wrote The Ancient Mariner is no less sublime than he who wrote The Tempest, but Coleridge had some incapacity to catch and express the thoughts of his genius. Was ever such wooden stuff as his conscious work? While Shakespeare had the knack of acquiring the knowledge necessary to the expression of every conceivable harmony, and his technique was sufficiently fluent to transcribe with ease. Thus we have two equal angels, one with a good secretary, the other with a bad one. I think this is the only explanation of genius. In the extreme case of Lavinia King, it stands out as the one thing thinkable. Lisa listened with constantly growing surprise and enthusiasm. I don't say, went on the mystic, that the genius and his artist are not inseparably connected. It may be a little more closely than the horse and his rider, but there is at least a distinction to be drawn. And here is a point for you to consider. The genius appears to have all knowledge, all illumination, and to be limited merely by the powers of his medium's mind. Even this is not always a bar. How often do we see a writer gasp at his own work? "I never knew that," he cries, amazed, although only a minute previously he has written it down in plain English. In short, the genius appears to be a being of another plane, a soul of light and immortality. I know that much of this may be explained by supposing what I have called the genius to be a bodily substance in which the consciousness of the whole race, in his particular time, may become active under certain stimuli. There is much to be said for this view. Language itself confirms it, for the words to know, gnosis, are merely sub-echoes of the first cries, implying generation in the physical sense, for the root gan means to know, only in the second place. Its original sense is to beget. Similarly, spirit only means breath, divine, and most other words of identical purport imply no more than shining. So it is one of the limitations of our mind that we are fettered by language to the crude ideas of our savage ancestors, and we ought to be free to investigate whether there may not be something in the evolution of language besides a monkey trick of metaphysical abstractions. Whether, in short, men have not been right to sophisticate primitive ideas, whether the growth of language is not evidence of a true growth of knowledge, whether, when all is said and done, there may not be some valid evidence for the existence of a soul. "The soul!" exclaimed Lisa joyfully. "Oh, I believe in the soul." "Very improper," rejoined the mystic. "Belief is the enemy of knowledge." Skeet tells us that soul probably comes from su, to beget. I wish you would speak simply to me. You lift me up and throw me down again all the time. Only because you try to build without foundations. Now I'm going to show you some good reasons for thinking that the soul exists and is omniscient and immortal, other than that about genius which we have discussed already. I'm not going to bore you with the arguments of Socrates, for although, as a member of the Hemlock Club which he founded, I perhaps ought not to say so, the Phaedo is a tissue of the silliest sophistry. But I'm going to tell you one curious fact in medicine. In certain cases of dementia, where the mind has long been gone, and where subsequent examination has shown the brain to be definitely degenerated, there sometimes occurs moments of complete lucidity, where the man is in possession of his full powers. If the mind depended absolutely on the physical condition of the brain, this would be difficult to explain. Science, too, is beginning to discover that in various abnormal circumstances, totally different personalities may chase each other through a single body. Do you know what is the great difficulty with regard to spiritualism? It is that of proving the identity of the dead man. In practice, since we have lost the sense of smell on which dogs, for instance, principally rely, we judge that a man is himself either by anthropometric methods, which have nothing to do with the mind or the personality, or by the sound of the voice, or by the handwriting, or by the contents of the mind. In the case of a dead man, only the last method is available, and here we are tossed on a dilemma. Either the spirit says something which he is known to have known during his life, or something else. In the first case, somebody else must have known it, and may conceivably have informed the medium. In the second case, it is rather disproof than proof of the identity. Various plans have been proposed to avoid this difficulty, notably the device of the sealed letter to be opened a year after death. Any medium divulging the contents before that date receives the felicitations of her critics. So far no one has succeeded, though success would mean many thousands of pounds in the medium's pocket. But even if it happened, a proof of survival would still be lacking. Clairvoyance, telepathy, guesswork, there are plenty of alternative explanations. Then there is the elaborate method of cross-correspondences. I won't bore you with that. Brother Cyril will have plenty of time to talk to you at Naples. Lisa sat up with a shock. Despite her interest in the subject, her brain had tired. The last words galvanized her. I shall explain after lunch, continued the mystic, lighting a third Bataga. Meanwhile, I have wandered slightly from the subject, as you were too polite to remark. I was going to show you how a soul with a weak hold on its tenant could be expelled by another. How, indeed, half a dozen personalities could take turns to live in one body. That they are real, independent souls is shown by the fact that not only do the contents of the mind differ, which might conceivably be a fake, but their handwritings, their voices, and that in ways which are quite beyond anything we know in the way of conscious simulation, or even possible simulation. These personalities are constant quantities. They depart and return unchanged. It is then sure that they do not exist merely by manifestation. They need no body for existence. You are coming back to the theory of possession, like the guardian swine, cried Lisa, delighted she could hardly say why. Cyril Grey interrupted the conversation for the first time. He swung round in his armchair and deliberately cleared his throat while he refixed his eyeglasses. In these days, he observed, when devils enter into swine, they do not rush violently down a steep place. They call themselves moral reformers and vote the prohibition ticket. He shut up with a snap, swung his chair round, and returned to the study of his big square book. I hope you realise, remarked Simon, what you have let yourself in for. Lisa blushed laughingly. You have set me at my ease. I should certainly never know how to talk to him. Always talk, observed Cyril Grey without looking up. Words, words, words. It's an awful thing to be Hamlet when Ophelia takes after Polonius. She wants to know how to talk to me, and I want to teach her to be silent, even as the friend of Catullus turned his uncle into a statue of Hippocrates. Oh yes, I know Hippocrates, the Egyptian god of silence, gushed the Irish-Italian girl. Simon gave her a significant glance, and she was wise enough to take it. There are subjects which it is better to drop. You know, Mr. If, said Lisa, to enlighten the sudden tension, I've been most fearfully interested in all you have said, and I think I have understood quite a part of it. But I don't see the practical application. Do you want me to get messages from the mighty dead?" "Just at present," said the mystic, "I want you to digest what you have heard, and the déjeuner which Brother Cyril is about to offer us. After that we shall feel better able to cope with the problems of the fourth dimension." "Dear me, and poor little Lisa has to do all that before she learns the reason of your leaving St. Jean de Luz." "All that and the whole story of the homunculus." "Whatever is that?" "After lunch." But as it turned out, it was a very long while before lunch. The bell of the studio rang brusquely. Cyril Grey went to the door, and once again Lisa had the impression of a duelist. No, it was a sentinel that stood there. Her vivid power of visualization put a spear in his hand. It was his own studio, but he announced his visitors as if he had been a butler. "Akbar Pasha and Countess Helena Mottich." Simon If sprang to the door. It was not his studio, but he welcomed the visitors with both hands outstretched. "Since you have crossed our threshold," he cried, "I am sure you will stay to déjeuner." The visitors murmured polite acceptance. Cyril Grey was frowning formidably. It was evident that he knew and detested his guests, that he feared their coming, that he suspected who could say what. He acquiesced instantly in his master's words. Yet, if silence ever spoke, this was the moment when it beggared curses. He had not given his hand to his guests. Simon If did so, but he did it in such a way that each of them was obliged to take a hand at the same moment as the other. Lisa had risen from the divan. She could see that some intricacy was at foot, but could form no notion of its nature. When the newcomers were seated, Lisa found that she was expected to regale them with the news of Paris. It was rather a relief to her to get away from the mystic's theories. The others left everything to her. She rattled off some details of Lavinia King's latest success, then suddenly noticed that Cyril Grey had laid the table. For his eager, cynical voice broke into the conversation. "I was there," he said. "I liked the first number. The dying Krampus fantasy in B flat was extraordinarily realistic. I didn't care so much for the misadventures of a pat of butter sonata, but the Tchaikovsky symphony was best. That was atmosphere. It put me right back among the old familiar scenes. I thought I was somewhere on the South Eastern Railway waiting for a train." Lisa flamed indignation. "She's the most wonderful dancer in the world." "Yes, she is that," said her lover with affected heavy sadness. "Wonderful. My father used to say, too, that she used even to dance well when she was 40. The nostrils of La Giuffria dilated. She understood that it was a monster that had carried her away, and she made ready for a last battle. But Simon If announced the meal. "Pray you be seated," he said. "Unfortunately today is a fast day with us. We have but some salt fish with our bread and wine." Lisa wondered what kind of a fast day it might be. It was certainly not Friday. The Pasha made a wry face. "Ah," said If, as if he had just remembered it, "but we have some caviar." The Pasha refused coldly. "I do not really want déjeuner," he said. "I only came to ask whether you would care for a séance with the Countess." "Delighted, delighted," cried If, and again Lisa understood that he was on the alert, that he sensed some deadly yet invisible peril, that he loathed the visitors, and yet would be careful to do everything that they suggested. Already she had a sort of intuition of the nature of the way of the Tao.